It's the BS detector back again. All right, I'm gonna try to like really, really read like super duper uber fast through this. Okay, we had left off at the word claptrap. Okay, this is Fauci, the Bernie Madoff of science and the HIV Ponzi scheme that connected the chronic fatigue syndrome epidemic by Charles Ortleb. This is for the purposes of education, commentary, etc., etc. Okay, I'm like really trying to like go through this really fast. Why didn't anyone other than Lauritsen notice the peculiar, unscientific defensiveness of the whole affair, i.e., that the ladies had protested too much? And most importantly, for the main event, why was HHV6, which had been discovered in AIDS patients 2 years before that curious Amphar forum, not put on the table for discussion? Fauci believed in the kind of transparency and communications with the public that are typical of abnormal science. He laid out the draconian media policy that he would maintain for the nearly 30 years he ran the totalitarian HIV/AIDS empire in a brief piece he wrote for the AAAS Observer on September 1st, 1989. Fauci wrote, quote, "When I first got involved in AIDS research, I was reluctant to deal with the press. I thought it was not dignified, but there was a lot of distortion by those who were speaking to the press, so I changed my mind," end quote. The distortion was, of course, coming from those who didn't agree with the very dignified Fauci about the etiology of AIDS. Fauci had his own idea of what the media's responsibility is. He notes that his interpretation of what the media is supposed to do, quote, "doesn't even jibe with what competent journalists think," end quote. He asserts that the big dilemma for journalists is between what, quote, is important and what is newsworthy. And he notes that they are sometimes, quote, are not the same. He whines about the fact that journalists are more interested in the latest story of a cure than the, quote, magnificent science, end quote, involving the regulatory genes of HIV. Fauci describes what he thinks as the hierarchy of media. It ranges from the New York Times and the Washington Post all the way down to the publications that, quote, care only about sales or have access to grind, end quote. He had yet to face the unwashed barbarians of the blogs and the commenters of the online forums. One can safely assume that the publications with access to grind were the ones who didn't agree with the acts that the petulant Fauci himself was grinding. Hold on. Okay, sorry. I had to let the dog in. She just would not stop scratching at the door. In, out, in, out. That's the game we play all day long. It's so much fun. Okay, anyways, where was I? Okay. Let's see. Okay. It is amusing that Fauci pontificated in 1989, that the, quote, media are no place for amateurs, particularly when talking about a public health problem of the magnitude of AIDS, end quote. Especially when one considers the magnitude of the HHHV6 public health problem that this very self-reverential scientist, quote, that Bruce Nussbaum described as lackluster, himself helped create for the whole human race. While Fauci would make one think that the real problem in AIDS journalism was the clownish journalist who can't spell, quote, retrovirus, or one who didn't listen carefully after asking questions, his real quarry in this peevish little piece is something far more serious. Fauci's real problem was journalists who not only could spell retrovirus, but could also actually hear what he was saying all too well. The kind of journalist who also knew things about retroviruses and listened to what he was saying so closely and critically that they could make life unpleasant for Fauci and his powerful AIDS cronies by asking inconvenient questions. Fauci's nose should have grown several feet when he wrote, quote, "We know that reporters must consult more than a single source and make room for dissenting opinions," end quote. What was yet to come in the AAAS piece made that one of the biggest fibs in the history of American science. Under the pretense of giving us a little lesson in the relationship between science and the media and warning that people too often believe what they read in newspapers, Fauci reveals his real agenda. Quote, "One striking example is Peter Duesberg's theory that HIV is not the cause of AIDS. I laughed at that for a while, but it led to a lot of public concern that HIV was a hoax," which it fucking is. And there's a book. I paid like, it was a used hard copy on Amazon, and this was, 4 or 5 years ago. I paid over like almost $200. It was like $175. I paid for this book through Amazon, through like a used bookseller, and it never showed up. And it was called The AIDS Hoax. Okay, so who knows if we can find a copy of that nowadays with, ChatGPT and all these other companies, AI companies, like trying to scrape all of the books they can of any kind of historical significance that would prove the revisionist history that they're fucking rewriting right now. Okay? Once the books are gone, we are fucked. Do y'all understand that? Anyways. Okay, Duesberg never said it was this was Fauci being intellectually dishonest on a couple of counts. Oh, wait, hold on. I laughed at that for a while, but it led to a lot of public concern that HIV/AIDS was a hoax. The theory had a great deal of credibility just on the basis of news coverage, end quote. Well, so now we see how the media really works with these evil shitlords that are in control. They don't want good journalism to even happen. They don't want the truth or any honest inquiry about the bullshit that they're trying to brainwash you about. They don't want any of that. They want zero opposition. Okay. This was Fauci being intellectually dishonest on a couple of counts. Duesberg never said it was a hoax. He said it was a mistake. A hoax is a whole other ball of wax. And it is a fucking hoax, but whatever. And it is an example of using language politically to deliberately misrepresent the opposition. Duesberg wasn't saying something similar to those who say that the landing on the moon was just staged with props and a camera. How fucking ironic, because I do say that the moon landing was fucking bullshit too, okay? You can either see the bullshit or you can't. And like, the moon landing is bullshit. It did not fucking happen. And if you believe it, did slap yourself, because you've got to be mentally retarded. Duesberg wasn't saying something similar to those who say the landing on the moon was just staged with props and a camera. He was a Nobel caliber expert on retroviruses, pointing out the deficiency of the HIV theory of AIDS using basic logic and analyzing the available evidence, which is what you should always fucking do. And blaming the media for the credibility given to Duesberg's ideas ignored all the scientists, eventually including 2 Nobel Prize winners, who publicly supported Duesberg's skepticism. Fauci was Trumpian in that he was essentially accusing those who spotted his fake science as being purveyors of fake news. Fauci then introduces us to the smarter member of his family, his sister. Quote, "My barometer of what the general public is thinking is my sister Denise. My sister Denise is an intelligent woman who reads avidly, listens to the radio, and watches television, but she is not a scientist. When she calls me and questions my integrity as a scientist, there really is a problem. Denise has called me at least 10 times about Peter Duesberg. She says, quote, Anthony, she is the only one who calls me Anthony. Are you sure he's wrong? That's the power of putting someone on television or in the press, although there is virtually nothing in his arguments that makes any scientific sense," end quote. Really? Because it made a lot of sense to me when I was listening to Duesberg. This captures how touchy Fauci was. No one was questioning his integrity as a scientist. His sister was simply asking him if it was possible that he was wrong. And the answer that would have shown some scientific integrity should have been, yes, my dear Denise, it is always possible that I'm wrong, although I think the evidence suggests I'm right. The fact that Fauci took this so personally speaks volumes about the petulant, chip-on-the-shoulder attitude problems of those in charge of AIDS. Fauci put it all on the line. Questioning his so-called science was a threat to his very being. It shouldn't surprise anyone that he was willing to viciously fight for so long during, quote, Schmolocaust 2, end quote, to keep everyone from seeing what a house of cards he had helped build. And it truly is a house of cards. The funny thing is that in a number of ways, the scientific masterpiece suggests he did have serious problems in the integrity department. Between the lines of the piece, of Freudian historians may one day even find the glimmer of a guilty conscience. No, I doubt it, because as we have just seen, for literally all to see, He pled the fifth, like how many? It was over either 500 or 1,000 times. He just pled the fifth in regards to the second time that he has unalived and has been responsible for the lives of many, many, many people. This time just being regular, degular Americans across the country and the world. Anyways. All right. Okay. People are especially confused when they see divergent viewpoints about the same thing. They do not understand that the beauty of science is that it is self-corroborating and self-correcting, that it is important for scientists to be wrong, end quote. If that's really the case, Fauci was indeed doing something incredibly important with HIV. It was actually Fauci who didn't understand that the whole process of self-corroboration and self-correction was being short-circuited by the totalitarian hijinks of the touchy HIV/AIDS establishment that was growing more dominant by the day. The very tone of Fauci's piece, its extraordinary imperiousness and presumptuousness about the stupidity of the public, points to the fundamental problem for a society in such arrogant and dishonest elite scientific communities have more and more power. That's the fucking problem. That's what I'm saying. Fauci would not only be the judge and jury of what is true science, but he also wanted to decide who deserved to write about it and what they should write. He clearly left no room for the possibility that the really good journalists would be the kind that questioned what he had to say. Fauci also made it pretty clear in that piece that try as they might, AIDS critics and dissidents would get absolutely nowhere because he was permanently stacking the deck against them. Quote, the lack of clear-cut black or white answers plagues the biomedical sciences compared with the physical sciences. Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann said that they had achieved nuclear fusion at room temperature. Other scientists tried, but they could not reproduce it. Bingo, it's over. But because we cannot ethically do clinical trials to establish that he is wrong, I am probably going to be answering Peter Duesberg for the rest of my life. End quote. Someone near him should have tried to convince Fauci that it wasn't all about him. One also loves the presumption that he was trying to control the official etiology of AIDS for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, he almost has. Beyond the breathtaking megalomania of the statement is the stupidity that the only way to show HIV wasn't the cause of AIDS was to do clinical trials with patients. All it would have taken would have been a few patients with AIDS who had no evidence of HIV. The only people that would be hurt by the implications of that finding would be the dishonest and incompetent scientists like Fauci, whose undeserved reputations and incomes had depended upon the HIV theory. And the big pharma industry is where he has made it rich, okay? For making drugs for fake fucking diseases that are only going to kill you in the end, okay? All this shit is fucking fake. Epidemiology. It's a fake science, and so is the science of virology. They're both pseudosciences, okay? And I am saying that here today on, I don't even know what the fucking date is, August, I don't know, 19th, 20th, something like that, of the fake year 2026, okay? No. All right? I'm sorry, but, like, none of this shit is real. Okay. All it would have taken would have been a few patients with AIDS who had no evidence of HIV. The only people that would be hurt by the implications of that finding would be the dishonest, whose incomes dependent on, yeah. Those HIV negative patients would be forthcoming in spades. In fact, those patients were basically the very immune compromised chronic fatigue syndrome patients a doctor named Richard Dubois had seen in his Atlanta practice before the socio-epidemiological construction of the heterosexist and racist HIV/AIDS paradigm. Hillary Johnson reported on the Dubois case and cases in Atlanta, Osler's Web, inside the labyrinth of chronic fatigue syndrome epidemic. Her epic work of journalism detailing the CDC's failure to acknowledge the true nature of the chronic fatigue syndrome epidemic. It is now all too painfully obvious that the Dubois cases with the telltale signs of hypergamma globulinemia, T-cell perturbations, and persistent reactive EBV and CMV infections were at the beginning of the real AIDS CFS HHVS disaster. According to Johnson, in 1980, Richard Dubois, quote, saw a 13-year-old girl who suffered from a seemingly endless case of mono. As the months passed, he identified several more cases of the curious syndrome in his practice, end quote. He wasn't alone. Johnson reported that he was in touch with other clinicians who had seen similar cases, and he and his colleagues eventually had a research article published about it in the Southern Medical Journal in 1984, the same year the big consequential government mistake of certifying HIV as the official AIDS virus occurred. According to Johnson, quote, they, Dubois and his colleagues, had believed that they were describing a new syndrome, one that would have increasing importance and was worthy of national attention, end quote. The Dubois patients morphed into the millions of chronic fatigue and HHVS patients that Fauci and his organization, which was supposed to handle infectious diseases, were willfully ignoring while building their Potemkin HIV/AIDS empire. At the end of Fauci's little AAAS piece comes the shot across the media's bow from the tiny AIDS czar. Quote, scientists need to get more sophisticated about expressing themselves, but the media have got to do their homework. They have got to learn the issues and the background, and they should realize that their accuracy is noted by the scientific community. Journalists who make too many mistakes, who are sloppy, are going to find that their access to scientists may be diminished, end quote. Wow. In other words, the scientists that journalists reported on were going to be the high-handed and underhanded final arbiters of what the public knows about science. They could decide to cut off journalists they defined as making mistakes and being sloppy, and one would assume that one of those sloppy mistakes would probably entail giving coverage to scientists like Peter Duesberg, who raised serious questions about what was being called good science by Fauci and the rest of the HIV/AIDS establishment. Fauci was basically saying that he and his cronies would only be accountable to themselves, which is the hermetically sealed, closed community essence of what should be called totalitarian, abnormal, and ultimately sociopathic science. And yeah, dude, like Peter Duesberg kind of, it's almost like, I don't want to say he became a joke because he was certainly not a joke, but he was taken less and less seriously because Fauci, you know, and his ilk were fucking with the press. If anyone ever makes a serious film about, quote, Schmolocaust 2, end quote, it will have to include the shocking revelation already referred to above that came to light during the 8th International Conference on AIDS in Amsterdam during July of 1992. Its historic importance rivals that of the Wannsee Conference during World War II or the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was the moment of no turning back, the moment a fateful line was crossed, a life of virtual pseudoscientific crime against humanity was virtually signed onto, and those responsible for Schmolocaust 2 lost all forms of plausible deniability. AIDS almost overnight became AIDSgate and a very unique Nazi-like biomedical and epidemiological assault against humanity. And ultimately, the man who stood at the center of the developments that came out of Amsterdam was Anthony Fauci. Before Amsterdam, one might be able to say that Fauci wasn't exactly the Bernie Madoff of the biomedical Ponzi scheme that maintained AIDS, chronic fatigue syndrome, and the HHV6 spectrum catastrophe, but not after Amsterdam. Hillary Johnson provided a detailed account of what happened at that Amsterdam conference in her book. She recounts how the conference was electrified by news from a small press conference that was held in California at which a scientist named Subhir Gupta, a University of California immunologist, reported he had isolated particles of a previously unknown retrovirus from an HIV-negative, ailing 66-year-old woman, her symptomless daughter, and 6 other patients, end quote. According to Johnson, quote, investigators of the lay press gathered in Holland were riveted by Gupta's announcement that the older woman suffered from an AIDS-like condition wherein a component of her immune system, a subset of T cells called CD4 cells, were severely depleted. In addition, she had suffered a bout of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, a so-called opportunistic infection that afflicted many AIDS patients whose CD4 cells were depleted, end quote. That announcement was soon outdone by a flurry of shocking revelations from additional scientists at the Amsterdam conference who had, quote, findings of retrovirus particles in HIV-negative patients with AIDS-like symptoms, end quote. A near panic was almost set off internationally by the possibility that there was a second previously unrecognized AIDS epidemic on the horizon that was caused by a non-HIV agent. According to Johnson, it turned out that the Centers for Disease Control was already aware of such HIV-negative cases of an AIDS-like illness. Johnson reported that months before Gupta's press conference, 2 CDC scientists had reported on, quote, 6 cases of non-HIV positive AIDS, end quote. Their conclusion was that HIV may not be the only infectious cause of immune deficiency, end quote. Yeah, duh fucking shit. We've got like 1,000 fucking causes of immune deficiency now because they're poisoning us in the sky, in the food, in the water. That's literally, I mean, dirty electricity. 6G is going to fucking microwave us slowly to death. But they want to act like it's an infectious disease or like it's some, you know, some catching something. No, bro. By all accounts and from every freaking direction and all different ways, we are being poisoned utterly, slowly to death by a myriad of different causes. Okay? Know that. Their conclusion was that, quote, HIV may not be the only infectious cause of immune deficiency, end quote. 2 AIDS viruses, a gay one and a straight one? OMG! The HIV-negative cases of AIDS-like illness set off an explosion in the press, most notably from Lawrence Altman, the reporter who guided the New York Times' dreadful, sycophantic reporting on AIDS throughout, quote, Schmolokos too, end quote. In the Times, Altman wrote that the CDC's embarrassment was, quote, huge because the agency had lost control over the dissemination of new information in the field of AIDS, end quote. Wow. That anyone at the Times could stress the importance of a government agency controlling information with a straight face is pretty amazing and revealing. Yeah, no shit. According to Johnson, the CFS research community was especially fascinated by the fact that the Gupta HIV-negative AIDS-like cases were chronic fatigue syndrome sufferers. And for anyone following the bizarre scientific politics of AIDS, it was interesting that Gupta's colleague, the man who supposedly isolated the new retrovirus, was none other than Zaki Salahuddin, the scientist who had worked for Robert Gallo and had faced criminal charges for creating a company that garnered illegal self-dealt income from his position at the National Cancer Institute. Johnson reported when Salahuddin was asked whether HIV-negative AIDS might be chronic fatigue syndrome, he said, quote, it's a fair statement, but I'm not a prophet. Time and money are required for this, end quote. Johnson also reported, quote, Salahuddin confirmed that he and Gupta, who had a cohort of CFS patients in his clinical practice and who had presented papers on the immunology of CFS at medical conferences on the disease, had discussed the possibility that CFS and non-HIV positive AIDS were the same disease, end quote. Also, according to Johnson, the non-HIV positive AIDS cases caught the attention of Paul Cheney, one of the 2 pioneering Lake Tahoe chronic fatigue syndrome researchers. Johnson wrote, quote, for years he had observed that some CFS patients met the government's defining criteria for AIDS on every account except infection with human immunodeficiency virus, end quote. He also told Johnson that, quote, it was hardly unheard of to diagnose victims maladies like thrush, candida, and pneumonia in CFS, which is chronic fatigue syndrome. In the world of normal science, this would have been called, quote, the smoking gun. The AIDS conference in 1992 should have been one of those great moments in normal science as described by Thomas Kuhn. It could have been a moment when disturbing, quote, anomalies should have attracted, quote, the attention of the scientific community. But this would not be a moment for AIDS research that, quote, the profession can no longer evade anomalies that subvert the existing tradition of scientific practice, quote, which would, quote, begin the extraordinary investigations that lead the profession at least to a new set of commitments, a new basis for the practice of science, end quote. This would not be one of those eureka moments in science characterized by, quote, the community's rejection of one-time honored scientific theory in favor of another incompatible with it, end quote. There would be no, quote, transformation of the world within which science was done, end quote. There would be no, quote, change in the rules governing the prior practice, end quote. As a result of what happened in Amsterdam, scientists would not alter their, quote, conception of entities with which they had long been familiar, end quote. Amsterdam would not cause the AIDS researchers' worlds to be, quote, qualitatively transformed as well as quantitatively enriched by fundamental novelties of either fact or theory, end quote. After the revelations of HIV-negative AIDS cases, the researchers would still not give up their, quote, shared paradigm. No new AIDS or chronic fatigue syndrome equals AIDS paradigm was allowed to reveal itself in Amsterdam and subsequently be fairly examined and debated. The HIV-negative cases of AIDS would not be recognized as an important scientific surprise that would lead scientists, quote, to see nature in a different way, end quote. The scientific world of AIDS researchers did not change, quote, in an instant, end quote, the way it might have if AIDS research was taking place in the world of normal science. And consequently, immune system destroying HHV6 would remain locked in the basement of science. Tragically, the HIV-negative AIDS cases were not a wake-up call for the scientists that, quote, something had gone wrong, end quote, and hence the anomalous cases were, quote, not a prelude to discovery, end quote. Even though the HIV-negative AIDS cases, quote, violated deeply entrenched expectations, end quote, they were not allowed to change anything about the AIDS paradigm. In Kuhn's world of normal science, the, quote, traditional pursuit prepares the way for its own change, end quote. Amsterdam showed that AIDS research was being conducted in normal science's cockamamie opposite world, one that should be called, quote, abnormal, totalitarian, and sociopathic science, end quote. Even if the HIV-negative AIDS cases could have ultimately led to a new paradigm that was, quote, able to account for a wider range of natural phenomena, end quote, they were dead on arrival. No, quote, novel theory, end quote, about AIDS, which was a, quote, direct response to crisis, end quote, was allowed to emerge because the abnormal, totalitarian, and sociopathic science of AIDS was politically invulnerable to crisis. At that historic conference, there was never any chance that the HIV-AIDS theory could be, quote, declared invalid, end quote, even though a new, quote, CFS is a form of AIDS, end quote, paradigm was starting out at the conference from a new anomalous data and was a perfectly credible, quote, alternate candidate, end quote. Kuhn wrote that the decision to reject one paradigm is always simultaneously the decision to accept another, and that the judgment leading to that decision involves the comparison of both paradigms with the nature and with each other, end quote. And that makes so much sense. And also, I think that the emergence of this, quote, chronic fatigue syndrome is probably the emergence of several different immunocompromised people diseases, like my mom's, you know, the MS. I know, like, isn't Crohn's an immuno thing? Like, all of these, now that we call them immunodeficiency or like immunocompromised, you know, people, like, I mean, they're all manifesting kind of separately, but at the same time, and nobody's like putting two and two together that maybe, I don't know, the vaccine program that we've had going on for 50 years or more, the shit they're spraying in the fucking sky, the shit they're putting in the food, Monsanto. I mean, who knows? There is any like number of causes for this emergence of, like, you know, immunosuppressing diseases. And it's because we're being poisoned. And Fauci knows this, okay? This motherfucker is not a scientist in any shape, form, or fashion. And the fact that people still, quote, stand with Fauci, like, y'all are straight retards, okay? Like, cancel me if you want to. Don't care. You're retarded if you stand with Fauci. All right. Let's see. Okay. The HIV negative AIDS cases were not allowed to catalyze that kind of fertile intellectual process in Amsterdam. Kuhn would probably argue that absent a new paradigm to examine and accept in Amsterdam, there was no exit from the HIV/AIDS paradigm because, quote, to reject one paradigm without simultaneously substituting another is to reject science itself, end quote. In a way, much of what happened at the AIDS conference was based on appeals to something quite characteristic of the AIDS establishment and abnormal science: authority. The petulant HIV/AIDS authorities basically said, quote, nothing here, folks, please move along, end quote. And unfortunately, the scientific community and the media, with few notable exceptions, did exactly that. Kuhnian anomaly didn't turn into Kuhnian crisis, and that in turn did not explode into Kuhnian scientific revolution as it should have. The HIV negative cases in Amsterdam should have led to a period of what Kuhn called, quote, extraordinary science, end quote, in which, quote, the rules of normal science become increasingly blurred, end quote. Although one could argue that the rules of the AIDS research already actually were a shocking chocolate mess. Amsterdam would not be the transformative moment when, quote, formally standard solutions of solved problems are called into question, end quote. The conference should have been a fruitful time when scientists were, quote, terribly confused, end quote. If things had gone the way they should have at that conference, the assembled AIDS researchers would have ultimately changed their view of, quote, the field, its methods, and its goals, end quote. HHV6 might have been allowed to reveal itself in all its pathological glory, and the scientists who had given us the HIV paradigm would have been revealed in all their vainglory. Had the science of Amsterdam been normal, both AIDS research and chronic fatigue syndrome research might have morphed into one unified discipline. Hi, Bunky, what you doing? What is it, my sweet girl, huh? Okay, let mommy read for a minute. Okay, let's see. Chronic fatigue might have morphed into one unified discipline. The dismantling of the, quote, chronic fatigue syndrome isn't AIDS, end quote, paradigm should have begun in earnest. HHV6 and its spectrum or family might have emerged quickly as the unifying viral agents of those two epidemics, which should have always been considered one in the first place. And those two epidemics were just the tip of the HHV6 iceberg. What happened in Amsterdam was a virtual nosological and epidemiological crime. It was a deliberate attempt to use sheer political force to make a legitimate scientific crisis disappear. And as a result, scientists would not turn to what Kuhn describes as, quote, philosophical analysis as a device for unlocking the riddles of their field, end quote. Quote, philosophical analysis, quote, was Greek to this confederacy of dunces. The crisis was not allowed to play itself out and would not loosen what Kuhn calls the, quote, stereotypes and provide, quote, the incremental data necessary for a fundamental paradigm shift, end quote. There would be no Kuhnian, quote, transition from normal to extraordinary research, end quote. It should have been painfully clear in Amsterdam, quote, that an existing paradigm had ceased to function adequately in the exploration of an aspect of nature to which that paradigm itself had previously led the way, end quote. A potentially life-saving scientific revolution in AIDS and in chronic fatigue syndrome research was politically nipped in the bud in Amsterdam, and in the months that followed, no new theory was allowed to surface that would permit predictions that are different from those derived from its predecessor, end quote. Kuhn asserted that the price of significant scientific advance is a commitment that runs the risk of being wrong, end quote. Those in control of the abnormal science of AIDS had no interest in engaging in any kind of science that would prove them wrong. Quote, wrong was not in their cultish vocabulary. They had bet their white heterosexual male professional reputations and the credibility of American science on their ridiculous and dangerous HIV/AIDS and chronic fatigue syndrome is not AIDS, end quote, paradigms. Fake dividends of their scientific Ponzi scheme would be paid out for decades. Yeah. Paid out through the government contracts and through drug companies. I mean, you can convince these fucking people that they have a disease that doesn't even really exist, and tell them they need to take these medications that are actually going to kill them in the long run, and then pretend like, see, this is a deadly disease. People are dying out here from this shit, when really it's the fucking medication that you're dying from. I saw it firsthand with my own two fucking eyes. Okay, in 1998 up to like 2001. What happened in Amsterdam was the opening and almost simultaneously closing of a Pandora's box of incredibly important scientific questions and implications. The person most responsible for keeping that box closed then and for the next 2 decades was the de facto AIDS czar, the tantrum-prone Anthony Fauci, who is still to this day killing people with his bad science. All right? Okay. This may have been the last chance for Fauci and the HIV/AIDS establishment to turn back from the precipice of the HHV6 spectrum catastrophe, but even his sister Denise could not save him from securing this dark place in history. According to Hillary Johnson, quote, on August 15th, federal scientists convened in a meeting in Atlanta to discuss the emerging health threat of non-HIV positive AIDS. In the 3 weeks since Sudhir Gupta's paper on his isolation of a new intracisternal retrovirus in a handful of cases, the number of reported cases has risen from approximately 30 to 50. Nobel Prize winners, members of the National Academy of Sciences, CDC's AIDS administrators, and Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, formed a panel to query scientists Gupta, David Ho of the Aaron Diamond AIDS Center in New York, and Jeffrey Lawrence, a Cornell Medical College cancer and AIDS specialist, an associate professor of the medicine, each of whom had been studying cases of the syndrome and discovered evidence of retroviral infection in patients, end quote. It didn't matter how many brilliant scientists from different institutions were queried at the meeting because their mindsets about HIV were all the same. It was like a mini Woodstock of groupthink. There was no turning back from the HIV/AIDS and, quote, chronic fatigue syndrome is not AIDS paradigm. The carved-in stone paradigm was 8 years old at that point, and the nation's heterosexist and racist AIDS propaganda and the public health policies had been built on its assumptions. The gay and black communities had been herded into it like cattle into a train. It was another moment in abnormal science which the privileged and paranoid foxes had formed a panel to investigate the henhouse. The manner in which Fauci and his colleagues basically covered up the shocking anomalies of HIV-negative AIDS was relatively simple and Orwellian. As previously noted, they disingenuously gave the HIV-negative cases an obfuscatory new name, idiopathic CD4 lymphocytopenia, or ICL. And they insisted by fiat that they were not really AIDS cases. The HIV/AIDS elite insisted that because there was no unifying geographical or chronological, quote, risk factor to be found in these ordinary Americans, and they shared no official AIDS risk factors, there was no HIV-negative AIDS or AIDS-like epidemic covertly occurring in the general population. Fauci's concerned sister Denise would not have to lose sleep at night, because the, quote, chronic fatigue syndrome is not AIDS, end quote, paradigm was not challenged by what happened at the Amsterdam conference in 1992 for at least another 2 more decades. The chronic fatigue syndrome patients were locked into their pathetic heterosexist wild goose chase and to find a cause while constantly avoiding the obvious links between their medical issues and AIDS. They had Tony Fauci's blessing for that fool's errand. His basic attitude towards chronic fatigue syndrome was that people shouldn't be ashamed of being told that their problem is psychiatric. Wow. Which was how the disease was deceptively framed by the government for nearly 3 decades. And of course, they were just the canaries in the HHV6 coal mine. Everyone suffering from multi-systemic problems of the HHV6 spectrum, like multiple sclerosis, like my mom had, fibromyalgia, autism, and even Morgellons, would ultimately pay a heavy price for the intellectual dishonesty and legerdemain of the 1992 AIDS conference. Fauci and his colleagues told the public that the HIV-negative cases of AIDS-like illness were rare, But of course, it all depended on disease definitions and who was doing the defining and counting. Fauci disingenuously sent out a call that summer asking that all HIV negative cases be reported immediately to him. An editorial in New York Native heeded his call. Quote, last week, Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases asked that all cases of HIV negative AIDS be reported to him. We reported 13 million American cases. That's the estimate of the number of cases of chronic fatigue and immune dysfunction, a condition that research, if anyone bothers to read it, suggests is essentially HIV negative AIDS, end quote. The editorial had no impact on Anthony Fauci, and it would not be the only time that he would ignore the New York native during the, quote, Schmolocaust too. One could ultimately say that Denise Fauci's petulant brother himself represented one of the most significant scientific paradigm shifts, one that moved the whole world from normal to abnormal, totalitarian and sociopathic science. During the Fauci years, the age of scientific racketeering began in earnest. Bernie and Madoff has a twin in science whose Ponzi scheme is a gift that keeps on giving. And this is the afterword. Scientific totalitarianism is the background music of Anthony Fauci's brilliant and long-lasting Ponzi scheme. A so-called liberal democracy like America demands a covert form of scientific totalitarianism that does not scare the horses of oversight and public opinion. Fauci knew how to manipulate the levers of institutional power and image-making in ways that Bernie Madoff would envy. For a scientific Ponzi scheme to prevail in America and Europe, nobody must recognize that they have acquiesced to a major medical and scientific fraud. But we have, bro, we have. Hence this whole fucking corona apocalypse bullshit that everyone fell for and allowed them to poison you with their fucking clot shot, okay? I mean, it's just what it is. It is what it is. Where my purebloods at. Anyways, sanctions should stand at the ready if they do. Nobody must see the telltale signs of fraud, deceit, and censorship. Fauci knew the tricks required to turn Ivy League educated elite journalists into servile puppets and perky stenographers. I coined the term Bob Club to describe the sycophantic journalist who enabled the massive scientific fraud of disgraced National Cancer Institute researcher Robert Gallo. The, quote, Tony Club is even worse and consequential in ways that will make medical historians generations to fully illuminate. A long list of servile journalists who were chummy with Fauci and enabled his Ponzi scheme will have a lot to answer for, as will Fauci himself. I mean, dude's definitely going to be burning in hell. He's like right up there next to Satan. An intimidating voice, a good haircut, and suits that fit well go a long way in science, especially if you're as skilled in the art of veiled and not so veiled threats as Fauci is. Laziness is not a Fauci flaw. It took a great deal of industriousness to cover up the role of the HHV 6, 7, and 8 family of viruses in, quote, AIDS, chronic fatigue syndrome, and a myriad of immune disorders that constitute the real AIDS epidemic that the Ponzi scheme conceals from the public. To keep the entire NIH establishment from dealing with chronic fatigue syndrome and its relationship to AIDS for almost 4 decades took a great deal of persistent effort. Fauci is not stupid. There is no way that some part of him didn't recognize that serious chronic fatigue syndrome research would have easily brought down his whole HIV house of cards if it hadn't been officially acknowledged, even noting publicly that it was uncanny the way any little bit of chronic fatigue syndrome research, and there was tons of it, showed the illness was similar to AIDS, would have threatened the Fauci Ponzi scheme. The HIV house of cards and the wall that separates AIDS and chronic fatigue syndrome are the Fauci legacy. The recognition that he got AIDS wrong because he got chronic fatigue syndrome wrong and vice versa would have turned him into an instant disgrace in the eyes of his family and friends. The egregious self-esteem he had carefully nurtured from his early days in Brooklyn would be a plate of Bethesda toast. In my career as the publisher of New York Native, 1980 to 1997, I had one phone conversation with Anthony Fauci in which I heard his petulance and thin-skinned nature in real time. I called him after I had written an editorial that was critical of Fauci in the form of a satirical poem. As readers probably suspect, Dr. Fauci does not have much of a sense of humor, especially when it is directed at him by someone in the media who does not know their place. I suspect that his desk at the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases is surrounded by eggshells. I believe that even though my newspaper went out of business in 1997, New York Native remains a thorn in his psyche to this very day. I doubt that he can hear the words chronic fatigue syndrome, HHV V6 or Peter Duesberg without thinking of New York native. Two of my reporters paid a price for their association with New York native. He was dramatically rude to one reporter when she showed up on the same TV show with him. He refused to shake the hand of another reporter when he was introduced to him at a medical conference. Not surprising, since I have already pointed out in the chapter above that Fauci basically said that members of the media would lose precious access if they didn't play ball. I will give credit to Fauci for being astute and recognizing my newspaper as his bête noire, because it does contain all the journalistic ingredients necessary for his eventual downfall. In my book about New York native, the chronic fatigue syndrome epidemic cover-up, you can watch the evolution of the Fauci Ponzi scheme from the beginning of the AIDS epidemic into the early years of the deftly handled chronic fatigue syndrome cover-up. From my experience covering the CDC and Fauci's antics, I now believe that scientific totalitarianism is fertile ground for medical and scientific Ponzi schemes. And when you find scientific Ponzi schemes, you know you have also encountered a culture of scientific totalitarianism. From watching Fauci and his public health puppets closely, I have constructed a list of elements necessary for a successful public health Ponzi scheme. Number 1, nosological fraud. That's the branch of medicine dealing with the classification of disease. It is ground zero for public health fraud. Number 2, epidemiological fraud. Number 3, virological fraud. Number 4, treatment fraud. Treatments that harm more than they heal or conceal more than they reveal. And that is the main thing I have said about this whole fucking coronapocalypse, is that the treatment fraud. There is so much fucking treatment fraud going on here. People are literally dying because of these treatments. And the same happened with HIV AIDS with my friend back in the 90s or the early 2000s. 5, public health policy fraud. 6, concealment of negative scientific data and paradigm challenging anomalies. 7, use of an elite network of old boys and pseudo-activist provocateurs to censor critics and whistleblowers. 8, chronic obscurantism. 9, if necessary, vigilantism and witch hunts against any intellectuals, scientists, or citizens who constitute any form of resistance to the Ponzi scheme. 10, a subservient scientific press that is used as a conveyor belt for the Ponzi scheme's propaganda. While you could say it took a village to put these elements into place, there really is only one person who has been able to control all of the aspects of the Ponzi scheme the way Leonard Bernstein controlled an orchestra. Anthony Fauci has been richly awarded for his ability to keep his Ponzi scheme going, just as Bernie Madoff was for his. These are just some of the awards Fauci has received. In 1979, the Arthur S. Fleming Award. In 1990, the International Chiron Award for Biomedical Research and Training from Accademia Nazionale di Medicina in Italy. 1995, the Ernst Young Prize, shared with Samuel A. Wells Jr. In 2002, the Albany Medical Center Prize. In 2005, the National Medal of Science. In 2005, the American Association of Immunologists a Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2007, the Mary Woodard Lasker Public Service Award. In 2008, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 2013, the Robert Koch Gold Medal, which is crazy because isn't that, maybe it's a different Koch that was doing Koch's postulates, but like the irony of that. 2013, the Prince Mahidol Award. 2016, John Dirks Canada Gardner Global Health Award. Fauci is one of the highest paid people in government. I leave it to historians to sort out how much he made from this scientific Ponzi scheme. Journalist Terry Michael was working on a book about Fauci's ill-gotten gains, but unfortunately died before he could finish it. Wow. If you search Google for articles or blogs that are critical of Fauci, except for a few notable examples, my work and Hillary Johnson's, you will come up empty-handed. Journalism about Fauci tends to be uniformed, uncritical, and lionizing. The most iconic piece about him was the canonization he received from a nun. In a Catholic news agency article, Sister Joan L. Roccasalvo wrote, quote, Dr. Fauci is blessed with a first-class temperament crowning his other achievements. This despite his own admission of being a perfectionist. Some years ago, at the height of the AIDS controversy, I listened to him delivering a lecture. In the Q&A, one person after the other lashed out at him. Quick to size up, deliberate to respond, this preppy-looking physician answered calmly and without condescension. His style, cool. Later he observed that the audience was lashing out at everyone and not at him in particular. He had walked with them in their pain. He absorbed their pain. Wasn't this Christ's way? And what of St. Luke, the physician, whose gospel is permeated with compassion for the most vulnerable? End quote. Give me a fucking break. And also, how funny that a nun, who I'm pretty sure was his own mother or father, you know, the fucking gender bending shit they do, but Mother Teresa, look at a picture of Mother Teresa and look at a picture of Fauci. They're fucking twinsies, okay? Sister Joan L. Rocasalvo outdid herself when she ended her piece by noting, quote, Dr. Fauci's inspiration cannot be measured. In fact, the beauty of such a life is the surest and most persuasive occasion to form disciples of the Lord and build a better world. God's love shines out from those who of themselves are unaware of God's limitless power working in their lives for good. So it is with Anthony Fauci, a man for others, a universal treasure, end quote. Gag. To that, one can only say what must be uttered when he speaks at NIH, quote, amen, end quote. Fauci knew the importance of good public relations. He could have taught Bernie Madoff a thing or two about working a crowd. If the nuns are on your side, you have nothing to worry about. See if you can find a YouTube moment when Rachel Maddow tells Fauci that she thinks he's a, quote, great American. When Madoff's Ponzi scheme was eventually exposed, it was shocking how obvious the scam was. Boston financial analyst Harry Markopoulos, the man who figured out what Madoff was up to, told 60 Minutes, quote, it took me 5 minutes to know that it was a fraud. It took me another almost 4 hours of mathematical modeling to prove it was a fraud, end quote. There was no shortage of people who discerned the glaring irregularities in the, quote, science, end quote, that bolstered Fauci's Ponzi scheme. In addition to the reporters at New York Native, there was a fascinating group of scientists and intellectuals I discussed in Peter Duesberg and the Duesbergians. In some ways, you could say that Fauci's Ponzi scheme has survived for so long because his critics were too nice. Assuming that their norms were being maintained, they were often collegial, hoping that reason would prevail. It would not. It's a shame that Fauci's critics didn't recognize that they were really whistleblowers and scientific crime fighters. They would politely make their points in a Fauci universe where critics were welcome to get jobs at Starbucks. You can't reason with someone who has Fauci's power and administrative long arms because at all times he is running and protecting a criminal enterprise. His fake science is always covertly fighting for its life. Two communities especially have failed to grasp the nature of Fauci's HIV Ponzi scheme and paid a terrible price for it. The gay community and the chronic fatigue syndrome community. The gay community and the chronic fatigue syndrome community are now victims of a massive epidemic associated with the HHV 6, 7, and 8 family of viruses, which I don't think any fucking viruses exist, but whatever. I will have more to say about this in a future book, but anyone who wants to explore the implications of the HHV 6, 7, 8 epidemic should check out the over 3,000 posts on my website, HHV6 University. It's very sad that the chronic fatigue syndrome community has never challenged the HIV/AIDS pseudoscience of Anthony Fauci. While there is a great deal of CFS-related hostility toward Fauci, it generally revolves around neglect of chronic fatigue syndrome rather than the cover-up of the obvious fact that what has been called AIDS and what has been called chronic fatigue syndrome are really just two different faces of one epidemic driven by the HHV 6, 7, 8 family of viruses. When new retroviruses were found in chronic fatigue syndrome patients by scientists Elaine DeFreitas and Judy Mikovits, the work was not discredited just because the retroviruses would show that CFS is real. The truth is that it was undermined because the work threatened to show that chronic fatigue syndrome is just another iteration of the AIDS epidemic. Judy Mikovits, the scientist whose work on XMRV, a mouse retrovirus she claimed to find in CFS patients, was initially the object of international adulation from CFS community, but a scientist connected with the AIDS establishment pulled the rug out from under her work by, quote, de-discovering XMRV, end quote. To the great disappointment to CFS patients and activists. If the CFS community knew the truth about AIDS and Fauci's Ponzi scheme, they could have turned the tables on scientists who sent Mikovits into exile because of her retroviral findings. They never asked whether HIV could have been de-discovered as the cause of AIDS if it had been as critically vetted as XMRV. I believe that one day historians will conclude that finding a retrovirus in CFS patients would have sent scientists quickly down a slippery slope to an understanding that HIV is not the real cause of AIDS and AIDS is not HIV disease. What has been called, quote, AIDS is on a spectrum of illnesses caused by the HHV 678 family of viruses, and that would not be a good development for the Anthony Fauci's brilliant Ponzi scheme. Because Fauci is close to retirement, he may never have to answer for the crisis he has created. I have spent more than half of my life covering this scientific Ponzi scheme. I am hopeful that these books below that I have written since the demise of the New York native will help future generations clean up the biomedical, political, and cultural mess left by the Fauci Ponzi scheme. And those books are as following. The Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Epidemic Cover-Up, How a Little Newspaper Solved the Biggest Scientific and Political Mystery of Our Time. And another one called The Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Epidemic Cover-Up, Volume 2, The Origins of Totalitarianism in Science and Medicine. The next one, Peter Duesberg and the Duesbergians, How a Brave and Brilliant Group of Scientists Challenged the AIDS Establishment and Inadvertently Exposed the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Epidemic. And one called The Closing Argument, a shocking courtroom novella about AIDS, chronic fatigue syndrome, racial injustice, and HHV6, the virus that threatens us all. And The Stonewall Massacre. The African Swine Fever novel, The Black Party, a dramatic comedy in 2 acts. The Last Lovers on Earth, Stories from Dark Times. Iron Peter, A Year in Mythopoetical Life of New York City, and Butterfly Ghosts, and The New Hippocratic Oath, earlier and later poems. So that was very interesting, and this guy seems to be a very, very good journalist. And like that was super, super good, super interesting. Anyways, I'm going to wrap it up now because we're almost at an hour. But that's good that I was able to get all of the reading in this little short. It's really just a snippet from a much larger set of volumes of books. But I just thought it was like an apt time, an appropriate time to talk about Fauci, the evil shitlord of epidemiology and virology, which is like total fake. It's total fakery and bullshit science. Anyways, don't quit believing the hype. Stop believing the news. They're fucking lying to you, bro. Anyways, peace out.